Rain traced slow, deliberate paths down the tall windows of the ducal estate, blurring the vast gardens into a watercolor of green and gray. Inside, silence held the corridors like a breath that had been drawn and never released. Servants moved quietly, as if sound itself might fracture something fragile at the heart of the house. He stood in that silence, hands clasped behind his back, watching the storm gather strength beyond the glass. At 30 he had inherited more than wealth. The title of duke had come with land, influence, expectation, and an unrelenting parade of people who smiled too quickly and bowed too deeply. He had learned early that admiration could be purchased, affection performed, loyalty negotiated. Genuine feeling, he had come to believe, was a currency no one spent without calculation. Your Grace. He did not turn immediately. The physician's voice was careful, respectful, rehearsed. She is asking for you. That was enough. He left the window and followed the man down the long corridor, each step echoing against polished marble. The air shifted as they approached the west wing, carrying with it the faint, sterile scent of medicine and something softer beneath it, lavender, perhaps, or memory. His mother's room was dimly lit, curtains drawn against the storm. Candles flickered despite the electric lamps, a concession to her preference for warmth over brightness. She lay against a nest of pillows, her once commanding presence diminished but not erased. Even now, there was something unyielding in the way her chin lifted, in the sharpness of her gaze as it found him. You took your time, she said, her voice thinner than it had been, yet edged with familiar wit. I came as soon as I was called, he replied, moving closer. He did not sit immediately. It felt too final, as though sitting meant accepting the gravity of her condition. She studied him, the faintest smile touching her lips. You've always been a poor liar. He exhaled softly and pulled a chair to her bedside. The doctor worries too much. The doctor is right, she said with quiet certainty. And you know it. There was no room for argument in her tone. There never had been. He looked at her then, truly looked. The strength that had once defined her seemed to have retreated inward, leaving her body frail but her spirit intact. It unsettled him in a way nothing else could. I am not afraid of dying, she continued, her gaze drifting briefly toward the window before returning to him. But I am afraid of leaving you alone in a world you do not trust. He frowned. I am not alone. She arched a brow, the gesture so familiar it almost hurt. No? Then tell me, who do you trust? The question settled heavily between them. He could have named advisors, acquaintances, allies. He could have listed titles and connections, a network of people who depended on him or sought his favor. But trust was something else entirely, something quieter and far rarer. He said nothing. Her expression softened, though the sadness in her eyes deepened. That is what I feared. He shifted in his seat, discomfort threading through him. This is not the time for such discussions. It is exactly the time, she insisted gently. I do not want to leave knowing that you will spend the rest of your life surrounded by people who see only your title. They see what is necessary, he said, a trace of bitterness slipping through. They see what you allow them to see, she corrected. Silence fell again, heavier now. After a moment, she reached for his hand. Her grip was weak but deliberate. Promise me something. He hesitated. Promises felt dangerous, binding in ways he could not control. Find someone who sees you, she said. Not the Duke. Not the wealth. You. He let out a quiet breath. And how, exactly, am I meant to do that? Her lips curved faintly. You are clever. You will think of something. The conversation might have ended there, but a knock sounded softly at the door. A maid entered, her posture respectful. Your Grace, she said, the new caregiver has arrived. His mother's eyes flickered with interest. Ah, send her in. The Duke straightened slightly, instinctively retreating into the composed persona the world expected of him. He had approved the hiring without much thought. Caregivers came and went, few left any impression. But as the door opened again, something shifted. She stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind her with care. She was younger than he expected, no more than 23 perhaps, with simple clothing that bore the marks of long days and modest means. There was nothing ostentatious about her appearance, nothing that demanded attention. And yet, there was a steadiness in the way she carried herself, a quiet assurance that drew the eye. Good evening, she said, her voice soft but clear. She did not immediately look at him. Instead, her attention went to his mother, her expression warming with genuine concern. I hope I am not too late, she added, moving closer to the bed. His mother regarded her with curiosity. You are right on time. The young woman smiled, a small, unguarded gesture that seemed to ease the tension in the room. She set down her bag and began to check the arrangements with practiced efficiency, her movements gentle, precise. The Duke watched her, something unfamiliar stirring beneath his usual detachment. Most people upon entering this room reacted to its grandeur, or to him. They glanced around, their eyes lingering on expensive furnishings, or they sought his gaze, eager to gauge his reaction. This woman did neither. Her focus remained entirely on the patient before her. "Are you comfortable?" she asked his mother, adjusting a blanket with careful hands. "I have been worse," his mother replied, amusement flickering in her eyes. The woman chuckled softly. "That sounds like a challenge." "It is," his mother said. "And I expect you to meet it." "I will do my best," she said simply. There was no flourish in her words, no attempt to impress. Just a quiet promise. The Duke rose from his chair, suddenly aware of his presence in a way he rarely was. He had the strange sensation of being irrelevant. She turned to him then as if only just noticing him. Her gaze was polite, neutral. "And you are?" she asked. For a brief moment he considered telling her the truth. It would have been the simplest path, the expected one. But his mother's words lingered, echoing in his mind. "Find someone who sees you." "I assist with the household," he said instead, the lie forming with surprising ease. "You may call me Daniel." The name felt foreign on his tongue, stripped of power and expectation. She nodded, accepting it without question. "Then I will rely on you if I need anything." No recognition. No shift in tone. No careful deference. Just acknowledgement. It was unsettling and intriguing. As she returned her attention to his mother, speaking to her with quiet warmth, the Duke remained standing, watching. For the first time in a long while, he felt the stirrings of something dangerously close to curiosity. Perhaps he thought this was the beginning of an answer. Or the beginning of a test he did not yet understand. Morning arrived quietly, as though the estate itself feared disturbing the fragile rhythm that had settled overnight. The storm had passed, leaving the gardens washed clean and glistening under a pale sun. Inside, however, nothing felt renewed. The air still carried that same suspended stillness, as if time had narrowed to the slow, measured breaths of a single room. He noticed her before she noticed him. She stood by the window in his mother's chamber, carefully drawing the curtains apart to let in light without overwhelming the dim interior. The movement was deliberate, considerate. Light spilled across the bed in a soft gradient, touching the edges of worn sheets, the curve of his mother's cheek, the faint rise and fall of her chest. "Too bright?" she asked gently. His mother shifted slightly, eyes fluttering open. "No," she murmured. "It's pleasant." The young woman smiled, adjusting the curtain a fraction more. She moved like someone accustomed to small negotiations, between comfort and necessity, pain and dignity. Nothing about her presence felt imposed. He lingered just outside the doorway, unseen. That had not been his intention at first. Yet something held him there, a quiet insistence to watch without interruption, to see what remained when no one important was believed to be observing. She approached the bedside with a basin of warm water, steam curling faintly into the air. "Let's make you comfortable," she said, her tone neither overly cheerful nor weighed with pity. It was balanced, steady. His mother allowed her, though not without a faint sigh. "I dislike being tended to." "I know," she replied, wringing out a cloth with careful precision. "But you do like feeling clean. We'll focus on that." A soft huff escaped his mother, half resistance, half reluctant amusement. He felt something shift in his chest. There was no performance here. No exaggerated gentleness meant to impress an unseen employer. The woman's care was practical, grounded in understanding rather than display. She adjusted pillows, supported frail limbs, and spoke in quiet intervals that respected both silence and presence. "You've done this before," his mother observed after a moment. "Many times," she said. "And yet you're not bored." "No," she answered simply. "Every person is different." There was a pause, then his mother asked, "And what am I?" The young woman hesitated just long enough to suggest honesty. "Strong," she said. Even now. The answer seemed to settle something in the room. He withdrew before they could notice him, the faint echo of that word lingering in his thoughts. Strong. It was how he had always seen his mother. Hearing it from someone else, someone who owed her nothing, felt unexpectedly validating. He found her again later, in the corridor, carrying a tray of medicine. "Daniel," she said when she saw him, offering a small nod. There was still no change in her tone, no curiosity beyond what was necessary. "You are settling in," he remarked. I am doing my work, she replied. That is enough. He leaned slightly against the wall, studying her. And if it were not enough? She paused, considering him with a calm, direct gaze. Then I would leave. I don't stay where I cannot be useful. The answer was immediate, unembellished. You are not concerned with the reputation of this place? He pressed lightly. Her lips curved faintly. Reputation doesn't comfort someone in pain. It was such a simple statement, yet it struck with quiet force. He folded his arms, masking the flicker of interest that rose again. You speak as though you have seen much. I have seen enough, she said, shifting the tray in her hands. Enough to know that kindness matters more when no one is watching. The words lingered between them, almost deliberate in their weight. Before he could respond, she inclined her head and continued down the corridor, leaving him alone with a thought he could not easily dismiss. That evening the house grew quieter still. Servants retreated, lamps dimmed, and the world beyond the estate seemed to recede entirely. He returned to his mother's room under the pretense of routine, though he knew by now that routine was no longer his true motive. She was there, seated beside the bed, reading aloud. Her voice carried softly through the room, steady and unhurried. The book itself seemed secondary. What mattered was the cadence, the presence of sound where silence might otherwise deepen into isolation. His mother listened with her eyes closed, her expression calmer than he had seen in days. You don't have to continue, his mother murmured at one point. I know, she replied. But I want to. There was no trace of obligation in her voice. He stepped inside then, allowing his presence to be known. She glanced up briefly, acknowledging him with the same measured politeness, then returned her attention to the page. No hesitation, no attempt to impress. He moved closer, watching as she adjusted the blanket again, almost unconsciously, ensuring his mother remained warm. You will tire yourself, he said. I will rest later, she answered. And if there is no later? He asked, testing the edge of her resolve. She looked at him, then really looked as though weighing something beneath his words. Then at least I will know I did what I could. There was no defensiveness in her tone, only quiet conviction. He felt the familiar instinct to challenge, to probe for weakness or hidden motive, but it faltered under the steadiness of her gaze. Instead he said, most would not go beyond what is required. Most are not here, she replied gently. His mother stirred, her voice faint but clear. She reminds me of someone. He turned to her. Who? She smiled faintly. Someone I once hoped you would become. The words landed with unexpected weight. He said nothing, but the implication settled deep. Night deepened, stretching the hours into something almost suspended. At some point he left the room only to return again, drawn by a restlessness he could not name. This time he found the lights dimmed further. His mother slept, her breathing uneven but steady. And the young woman remained at her side, though exhaustion traced itself in the slight slump of her shoulders, the way her head tilted as she fought the pull of fatigue. She reached out, adjusting his mother's hand where it lay against the sheet, her touch instinctively gentle. You're not alone, she whispered, so softly it might have been meant only for herself. He stood in the doorway, unseen once more. There it was again, that unguarded moment, stripped of any possibility of performance. No audience, no expectation. Just quiet reassurance offered to someone who might not even hear it. Something tightened in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. He had expected to find pretense eventually, some fracture in the illusion of sincerity. Everyone revealed themselves given enough time. Yet she did not bend. She did not falter. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. Because for the first time he was no longer certain whether he was observing her, or being quietly, irrevocably changed by what he saw. Night did not fall so much as it settled, heavy and deliberate, over the estate, pressing silence into every corridor and corner. The world beyond the windows dissolved into darkness, leaving only the faint reflection of candlelight trembling against the glass. Inside, time seemed to contract, measured not in hours but in breaths, uneven, fragile and increasingly uncertain. He had not intended to return so soon. Yet something restless had taken hold of him, a quiet insistence that refused to loosen its grip. It drew him back toward the west wing, toward that dim room where life and loss lingered in uneasy balance. The door was slightly ajar. He heard it before he saw it, a sharp, strained inhale followed by a broken exhale that did not quite complete. It cut through the silence with unsettling clarity. He pushed the door open. His mother lay rigid against the sheets, her breathing shallow, her face drawn tight with pain. The calm that had softened her earlier was gone, replaced by a visible struggle that tightened something deep in his chest. The young woman was already at her side. "Stay with me," she murmured, her voice low but steady, even as urgency sharpened her movements. Her hands moved quickly, adjusting pillows, checking her pulse, reaching for medicine with practiced precision. "Daniel," she said without looking at him, the vial on the tray. He moved before thought could interfere, retrieving it and placing it in her hand. The moment felt stripped of pretense, his assumed identity no longer a game but a role demanded by necessity. "She's in pain," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "I know," she replied, administering the dose carefully. "We need to keep her comfortable." Comfort. The word felt painfully small against the reality unfolding before him. His mother's hand twitched weakly against the sheets. The young woman caught it immediately, holding it with quiet firmness. "You're not alone," she whispered again, closer this time, as if willing the words into something tangible. "I'm here." The room seemed to narrow around that single point of contact. Her hand around his mother's, steady against the tremor of failing strength. Minutes stretched, elastic and uncertain. Gradually, the sharpness in his mother's expression eased, though her breathing remained fragile. The tension in the room loosened but did not disappear. The young woman exhaled slowly, as though only now allowing herself to acknowledge the weight of what had just passed. "You can rest," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. She shook her head. "Not yet." There was no stubbornness in the refusal, only quiet resolve. He watched her as she adjusted the blankets once more, smoothing them with a care that felt almost reverent. Her movements slowed now, the urgency fading into something softer, more deliberate. "You stayed," he said, the observation slipping out before he could contain it. She glanced at him briefly. Of course. Many would have called for assistance and stepped away. And leave her like that? There was no accusation in her tone, only genuine confusion. No. The simplicity of it unsettled him more than any elaborate explanation could have. Silence returned, though it felt different now, less oppressive, more intimate. Eventually, his mother drifted into a fragile sleep, her breathing uneven but calmer. The crisis had passed, at least for the moment. The young woman remained seated beside her, her posture finally giving way to exhaustion. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the tension of the past hour settling into her frame. He moved closer, drawn by something he no longer attempted to resist. "You should rest," he said again. She let out a quiet breath, her gaze lingering on the sleeping figure before her. "In a moment." But the moment stretched, unclaimed. Instead, she lowered her head, her fingers still loosely wrapped around his mother's hand. For a while she said nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, her composure shifted. A tear slipped free, tracing a silent path down her cheek. He stilled. It was not dramatic, not accompanied by sobbing or sound. It was quiet, restrained, and somehow more profound for its restraint. "You care?" he said softly. She gave a faint, almost incredulous laugh, brushing the tear away. "Is that surprising?" "Yes," he admitted, the honesty catching him off guard. She turned to him then, her eyes reflecting the dim light. "Why?" He hesitated. Because care was usually conditional. Because it was often performed for recognition, for reward, for advantage. Because he had spent years learning to see through it. "I have seen many who pretend," he said finally. "And you think I am pretending?" The question was not defensive. It was curious. "I thought you might be," he said. She considered that, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she shook her head slightly. "That sounds lonely." The words landed with quiet precision. He felt them more than he expected. "I prefer certainty," he replied. "Certainty can be a kind of loneliness," she said gently. He did not respond. Instead, he found himself studying her, really studying her, for the first time without the filter of suspicion. The exhaustion in her posture, the softness in her expression, the quiet steadiness that had not wavered even in the face of fear. "Why do you do this?" he asked. She followed his gaze briefly to his mother, then back to him. "Because someone has to." "That is not an answer." "It is mine," she said simply. "Not everything needs to be complicated." He almost smiled at that. Almost. The room fell into a softer silence, the kind that no longer demanded to be filled. After a while she spoke again, her voice quieter now. "When people are close to the end, they don't need perfection. They need presence." He absorbed that, the words settling into something deeper than thought. "And you believe that is enough?" "I believe it matters," she said. "Even if it doesn't change the outcome." He looked at his mother, at the fragile rise and fall of her chest, and felt something shift within him, something that had been rigid for far too long. For years he had measured worth in permanence, in legacy, in things that endured. But here, in this quiet room, she was offering something entirely different. Something fleeting. Something real. He turned back to her, and for the first time, there was no calculation in his gaze, no careful distance. Only recognition. "You stayed," he said again, though the words carried a different weight now. She met his eyes, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "I told you I would." And in that moment, something within him gave way, not dramatically, not all at once, but with the quiet certainty of something inevitable. He felt it in the stillness, in the echo of her words, in the fragile peace that had settled over the room. It was unfamiliar, unsettling, and undeniable. He had spent years guarding himself against illusion. Yet here, in the dim light of a room shaped by endings, he found himself confronted with something that felt impossibly, dangerously real. And as he stood there, watching her remain beside his mother long after the urgency had passed, he realized with a clarity that left no room for doubt. He had not only believed her, he had fallen for her. And she still had no idea who he truly was.